This is Jack Moelmann, and with me on this particular conversation rather than interview is Jonas Nordwall. We're in Belleville, Illinois, which is near St. Louis. It's the 27th of March 2011, and Jonas is part of the Trio Cum Brio concert that we had here at the Lincoln Theater, not too far from the building we're in right now, and the concert was this afternoon. And I thought, well, while he's in the area, we'll just have a little chit-chat, and because he's really, in my opinion, one of the great organists of the, I won't say the world. Yes, I will. He really is. And so we're glad to have you, Jonas. Where did you, or when did you start into the music business?
I think I was about 4 years old. And we had music around the house. My mother was a pretty good pianist, and my dad was a vocalist, and sang with a couple volunteer choruses in the Portland, Oregon area. And what really got me going, of course, was on the piano. And then I had been around, our heritage is Swedish, and of course you'd be around at a lot of dances and there were accordions, so I'd heard that and kind of got infatuated with an accordion. And in about 1953, when television really came to Portland, there was an afternoon show on, it was from 4:30 to 4:45. And there was a guy playing a Hammond organ, and it came out of Los Angeles, and his stage name was Korla Pandit. And it was just kind of a wild thing, because here's this guy in a turban sitting there playing on a Hammond B3, and you know, just, it was an interesting collection of music and travelogues. So that got my attention as far as what the organ was. And then in 1955, there were two things that happened. The first was that the local big skating rink, the Oaks Park roller rink, upgraded from their 13 rank organ to an 18 rank that they got from the Broadway Theater in downtown Portland. And I guess it's a statement about how much was going on in Portland at the time when this was on the front page of the newspaper. And we didn't live too far away from where the rink was, so we went down and I heard that. And of course, after hearing an accordion, and all of a sudden we hear this massive instrument. And I just got to know, this is what I've got to do. And I went down to the rink at least once a week just to watch him play the organ. And by this time I was taking accordion lessons. And then one thing kind of led to another. My dad and Mom were on a business trip in Vancouver, BC, and we were walking down the street by a record store, and here is this record in the window, and it's got a picture of a pipe organ with 5 manuals, keyboards on it. The Oaks organ was only 4, and of course, you know, well, it's 5, it's got to be that much better. And that album was my introduction to George Wright. And at the same time with the accordion world, I had heard his name mentioned with the Charles Mingnani Trio. That was really a popular musical group at the time. And of course, they had done a lot of broadcasting in New York and had releases on Columbia Records. So got more in that particular influence. And then also in that same year, like I mentioned, in 1955, Marcel Dupré came to Portland. In fact, it was his last time touring in our neck of the woods. And our neighbors were really interested in classical organs, so they took me along to hear him play on the E.M. Skinner that was in our civic auditorium. And of course, you know, for a 7-year-old, there's a lot of music that just goes right over your head in a classical organ concert, but I was still just in awe of watching him, you know, perform at the console, and plus the fact you heard all the effects that he was making, because that Skinner used to just pick that auditorium up and move it. And as things progressed, one of our neighbors became the con organ dealer. And this was about the time of the organ centennial, which was 1959, and of course I was doing a lot of accordion playing at the time. In fact, we would play on this, it was a ferry boat that was brought up from San Francisco, and it went from downtown Portland on about a 10-mile trip up the Willamette over to the Columbia River and over to the Exposition Center. And at the center, of course, everybody who was in the music business had a booth, and there were a number of electronic organs represented. And as I mentioned, our neighbor was one of those exhibitors. And so the stuff I had heard on the George Wright recording, I figured, oh, there's got to be a way I could play that stuff. And of course, you know, like everybody coming into the organ, you're just baffled with the pedal board. And the only piece I really could play was Caravan, because it was just C sharp and C in the pedals, and those were safe. And the dealer eventually put me in touch with a local organ teacher, and who was actually a fine piano teacher. And it was just kind of put to me, if you want to do this, here's the regimen. You have to have piano along with your organ. And one thing led to another. And I was doing a lot of regional playing for the Conn Organ Company by the time I was in high school. And also at the same time, came into contact with people from the Rogers Organ Company. And in fact, the financial backer of Rogers was a gentleman by the name of Howard Moelmann, who was the co-founder of Tektronix. And Howard had grown up in the same neighborhood my mom did. And they were at some social function. He says, oh, I've heard your son, you know, been playing for Conn. He says, we have this Rogers Organ Company. He said, you should bring him out and let him try to play it. And that was in the early 60s. And I still continued playing for Conn. And then later in high school, I took a couple jobs. One of them was at a small Christian Science church. And at the same time, I was the assistant organist out of the Oaks roller rink, and worked with a senior staff organist by the name of Don Simmons. And Don was a very unique player. He wasn't the average roller rink style player. It was like a big band approach. And obviously influenced a lot of things I did. And then, actually it was in 1966 was my real first major association with ATOS as far as playing. I had played some chapter meetings. In fact, I'm one of the original members of the organ chapter. And at that point, the convention was in Portland, and originally Andy Crow was supposed to present a brand new Rogers model, and that was the old 33E. And it turned out Andy was unavailable, and because I was local, I was given the opportunity to play it for the convention as a concert. And that was my first actual concert at a convention. And of course, it's been, through the years, I've played for many since that time. But then also, I was fortunate enough to have a pretty diversified background. I went to the University of Portland, and there were some people on music faculty and had a lot of ins with LA studio musicians. And we used to bring them up. We had a stage band festival, and I was the principal pianist for the stage band and for other things for the choral department as well. And so I had some really rare opportunities. It wasn't unusual. You would hear that Doc Severinson's coming to town because his parents lived in Portland. And so the head of our department, Don Kamak, gave him a call. Hey, why don't you come out and do a little seminar with the guys in the bands? And it's like when California Dreaming came out, Bud Shank, of course, had done the flute solo. Well, Bud was an incredible saxophonist. We had him up, Frank Rosolino, Clark Terry, the list goes on, the people I was able to work with. And then, of course, eventually got to meet with George Wright, who became a very good friend. And George never taught anybody. He just sat around and talked, and it was a type of thing, if you asked the right question, you got the right answer. And that relationship lasted until his death.
Then you spent a certain amount of time, like a lot of the organists that have been around, playing in the pizza parlor.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, it was all kind of tied into Rogers. I was 18 when I played that concert in 1966, and that led to my employment with Rogers. And one of their engineers, who also was a good friend of mine by the name of Dennis Hedberg, had purchased the Wurlitzer that was in the Oriental Theater, Portland, and it was a specialized instrument, even in its original concept. It wasn't a stock organ. And originally he wanted to put it into another theater and enlarge it, and that never came about. And he happened to get together with some people who were restaurateurs who were interested in the concept of the pizza parlor and pipe organ. And between all of us, we created the organ grinder. And I did that really not as a full-time job. I do it as part-time in addition to working for the Rogers Company. And most of the time, if I were in town, I'd play maybe like a Monday evening for a few hours, Friday evening, and maybe every other Sunday. And in the late 70s, the grinder decided to expand to another place in Denver. And I kind of flip-flopped where I started doing full-time at the restaurant, and I was doing part-time work with Rogers. And did that for a few years, but that wasn't, it was fun, but it wasn't as challenging. So then I went back full-time with Rogers in 1983. And stayed with them until I retired when I was 50. And I was with them 32 years, so it was a long and a good association.
You know, at the beginning of this, I failed to say you were from Portland, Oregon, but I assume by now everybody knows that you're from Portland.
Right.
What do you think of all of the programs you've done on the organ, be it theater, classical, or whatever? What do you think was the most exciting, most spectacular, both in terms of the performance and the instrument that you played on?
It would be pretty hard to nail it down to one. I mean, there's several. And again, I've been very fortunate to get some very unique experiences. And in the mid-90s, I played at the Detroit convention and then played at the Fox Theater. And even though I was playing the convention concert, I had the opportunity to play for a full house. AMC was doing one of their taping sessions. And there was just very limited practice time on the organ. So the organists who were at the Fox said, hey, why don't you just play the evening? It's 35 minutes of music, but you get to have some more console time, plus the fact you can play the instrument when the place is full, which very few people get the opportunity to do. That was pretty amazing to play for almost 5,000 people at one time, because you can't play the instrument in a real super artistic mode. I mean, you have to just make a lot of noise. And basically there were about 3 combinations, and one of them would be like double forte, triple forte, and quadruple forte, because the room's so big and with that many people talking, it just had to create sound. The other concert, I have to say, that was probably the most mind-boggling of all. Did a live, it was a broadcast and a concert from Sydney Town Hall in Sydney, Australia. And during this time, this was in the early 80s, and Australia was catching up to the United States in promoting late night shopping. And Thursday evening was the late night shopping night, and the town hall had a series of organ concerts. They did have a staff organist down there, Robert Ant, but they would bring in guests. And so I was one of the guests that got to perform, and then it turned out an Australian broadcasting company came in and recorded that. And the organ's an amazing organ, and actually it's the only one with a true working 64-foot on it. But the sensation, the textures and everything about it, it's just one amazing organ.
Well, let's take the opposite side now. What would you think was the most challenging, difficult, complicated, whatever, without, in terms of both performance and instrument? There's got to be several.
Oh, yeah, there's several that would qualify for that. One of the most noticeable things that I remember is playing, I think it was a private organ club around Washington, D.C. area. And it was a privately owned organ. And the gentleman that put it in had done a lot of shortcuts. In fact, there wasn't one solid piece of wind line. Excuse me, so there was a lot of what was called flexhaust. And of course, every time he would turn a tremulant on, the wind line would start shaking and dissipate most of the energy. So there was very little tremulant resolved. And so we went down to a hardware store and we bought a bunch of tin line and basically got in with duct tape and created as many solid portions of that as possible. But also the instrument had a lot of musical issues, and there were dead notes all over the place. You really couldn't play just a given rank, even for an octave, to play a solo line and expect to have every note play. And unfortunately, I mean, those kind of situations occur every so often. But you learn to live with it.
Well, these days you're heavily involved in the ATOS summer camp and young people and all of that. What would you be your message to the young people of today as to how to approach this as an art form or as an instrument, either as a performer, a listener, a maintainer, anything you want to say?
That's a good question, because I mean, you're not the first one to broach that. It's interesting because times have changed. I mean, when I grew up, obviously there was the roller rink, and I also forgot to mention I was messing around at both Art Oriental and Paramount theaters, so you had that exposure to the sound, and then also to the myriad of people who were playing at that time. And plus the fact there were the venues, performance venues, that were just far more abundant than what they are now. And when we work with the kids, we know the kids are hooked. They love the sound of it, and they want to know more about it. They want to know about performance styles. And the one thing that we tend to promote is, while we want to focus on the better traditions of the past, we want them to try to develop their own creative ideas. How can they take this instrument and bring it into their future? And as a performer, how do you find an audience? How do you get people turned on to the sound of this? And in some of it, it's using newer music. It's like a lot of the kids play new film score stuff, and they play it exceptionally well. And then you also still have kids that, like all of us, we like to go back to our comfort zone, and that's usually music of, when we were teenagers, it's stuff that we're familiar with. But there's a new audience for some of that. It's like people are enthralled now with, rock music from the 50s and the 60s. Likewise, there's a lot of people who are, like my daughter and her husband. When they were first going together, they got interested in ballroom dancing, and they discovered the music of Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, and Gershwin, everybody who contributed to the Great American Songbook that was the staple of the 30s and 40s. And in fact, you go to parties at their house, background music is not new music. What you hear is the Great American Songbook, and they circulate with their friends in that community that's their stable of culture as far as pop music is concerned. And I think that's where the theater organ is too. It's part of the pop music culture.
Well, we thank you for your time, Jonas. You probably hear some music playing in the background right now. It has nothing to do with the Muzak system in this building, but there's a reception and a dinner here tonight, and that's what you hear in the background. But I think we want to thank you for being here and sharing your views and your background and everything else. So let's sort of bring this to an end and give you the final word.
Well, all I can say is enjoy a theater organ. They're here. The thing that I look at, it is the second indigenous instrument to the American musical culture. The first is the banjo and the theater organ, and while banjo music is great, I think a theater organ's got it big, hands down. So I can't encourage people to take and enjoy it enough.
Thank you, Jonas.
Thank you.